So Michael comes to us from Evergreen Energy. He has 20 years of experience in development, construction, operation, and management of industrial and energy systems. He has managed the development, construction, and startup of over $1 billion of new systems. Michael holds a BS in business finance from the University of Notre Dame. And Michael actually knows a lot about how to get a community vision. This is not part of his bio, but I can tell you that Michael is a good listener. He's able to drive a vision into more concrete pieces. He's able to put together the plan, if you will, and very nimble and resourceful at looking at local resources. So with that, I'd like him to tell us what he has to say today, and we'll have time for questions, I promise. Here you go.
Thanks, Lakshmi. To the gentleman's question, I think Jim Lodge must have walked out, but Jim, and if Joel's in here, I think it's a good example NRG has going on in Pittsburgh right now, where they actually had the city. Joel, I was just touching on to the last question, where you have the city of Pittsburgh and Mercy Hospital, the hospital, together really from day one coming together with your plan. So that's I think to the question that was asked earlier, that's a scenario where it's very important to have the customers and the community, the city, the municipal, the public institution with you all the way through. I'm sure there's some horror stories you could tell, but ultimately you got to a successful conclusion there in Pittsburgh, and it's a good result there. Really good discussion, and I don't want to be redundant with what was talked about, so I will spend a little bit more time on a couple of case studies that really take the conversation around the challenges that can be that you can incur in trying to develop a system, and particularly when trying to develop a new system, when being led from the community itself, or whether that community is a city or a county. They have different kinds of challenges, or a federal government or a state government. They have some different challenges, some different struggles in trying to get a district energy system off the ground, or taking what is existing capacity serving public institutions and bringing that out into the broader public, making it available for private businesses, private buildings as well. The gentlemen were talking earlier about the fact that it's hard. You need that flagship benchmark customer to get going, and it's interesting. One thing we often say is a district energy system can be as simple as 2 buildings connected to each other, but getting those first 2 buildings connected to each other is much harder than getting from 10 to 11 or 50 to 51. Once the infrastructure is in place, once you have something people can touch and feel, it's a lot easier just to time your connection to the next building to whenever they're going to have to replace their chillers, boilers, or a new development comes down the road, and you connect that up. But going into a new community and convincing a number of private buildings that aren't aware of district energy, have never been involved in district energy, or could even view it as competition, particularly at the facility management level, that's a tougher haul. And so that's where you get into some challenges. And then, of course, layering in with that some of the constraints that the public institutions face, again, when speaking, whether it's a city or a county or some other governmental entity. So, of course, the typical challenges that really Lakshmi and the others spent a lot of time talking about. You've got constrained capital budgets. You've got both on the private and the public side, you've got those constraints. You've got dynamic customer needs where each individual building has different timing of when they want to be connected, some new development that needs to go now, but then you've got a public entity that maybe can't move as quickly as it would like to. You've got goals for a development area and you have competing goals, whether it's around energy efficiency, or it's around GHG reduction, or it's around just cost competitiveness, or equity as it relates to social equity within the area. And then ultimately now on the conservation side, there's folks talking more about water and district planning around transportation districts and parking districts. And so you've got all of these significant competing goals that these communities face. And energy is one of them, but it isn't necessarily prioritized for everybody as the most important. It is for us, but it isn't necessarily for those folks at City Hall or at the county who are thinking about what to do. On the financing side, it's easy to get a city, a county, institution to come up with $150,000, $100,000, $75,000, do a little bit of a study, figure out what should be done. But then what? So you lay out a plan, you determine where you can go, and everybody looks at it and sees that it could help achieve those goals that you're trying to achieve, whether the goals again are environmentally based or economically based or something else. But now it's that $1 to $3 million of at-risk capital that somebody needs to put in to get that to go, and maybe a little easier if you've got some equity investors and somebody who's looking to come in and take the whole pie. But when they're looking at it from a city or a county's perspective, that's a tough lift for them, and so that's something they're continuously trying to balance when trying to push forward this goal of implementing a district energy system. There's new tax law coming through about off-balance sheet transactions and how that could be affecting the energy service agreements that some systems are putting out there. You definitely can leverage at-risk capital to bring in expected returns, but sometimes that's a challenge too for those public entities because now there's going to be competing goals from those investors coming in. They might not necessarily view GHG reduction as important as a return, and so you've got those things to balance as well. So a lot of these things are similar to what Lakshmi talked through. I don't mean to reiterate them or just talk through them, but in looking at we're touching on a couple of case studies here of a couple of systems we're working on right now where they are trying to manage all of these things. And the two examples that we walked through, one is of an existing system that is serving public-only buildings, and so you have existing infrastructure, existing systems in place, and they're talking about growing to serve the private market. And the second example is one where it is just truly a new redevelopment that has significant goals that are beyond just energy, and coming up with this best strategy for how to implement while still staying true to the district energy system goals that have been established. So the first project is down in Lincoln, and we have a couple of individuals here from Lincoln. Dan has talked extensively in the past of what the vision is for DEC and for Lincoln's energy systems, and certainly don't mean to reiterate anything that Dan has touched on, and actually, shameless plug, he and I are talking tomorrow in a little more specificity about technically what we're looking at. But I did want to pull just a few pieces out of this regarding just the institution and the organization itself and some of the challenges and outcomes we're looking at to grow district energy in Lincoln. This map I like just because it gives you a sense of what is there today. And there's actually, beyond the University of Nebraska system, there's 3 different interlocal district energy cooperatives, for lack of a better term, each with different level of involvement between the city, the county, the state, and the university. And each of those systems serves public buildings within that area, with the exception of the West Haymarket system on the left side of the map, which serves a special service district. So there's private buildings within that area, but it's a special service district where those buildings are required to connect to the system, and that is a cooperative agreement between the university and the city for purposes of managing that. But a lot of infrastructure in place already, distributed throughout the downtown corridor, and capacity at each one of those systems that could actually grow and serve private buildings around and bring greater benefit to the overall community. We've got the Ottawa guys here. It sounds a little familiar for you guys, doesn't it? Over the last year, we've gone through some master planning for the systems, again, looking just the technical feasibilities, talking with the customers, identifying opportunities and the goals that the customers would have, or prospective customers on the private building side, and really on a block by block, building by building basis, identified technically who could be compatible with district energy systems. So you have this mapping here. It shows both from a energy density perspective on a block by block basis, and then on a building by building, how compatible the individual buildings are. And then as we looked at how the systems could grow, you can see that we identified what we would recommend as a phase 1, phase 2 growth, with ultimately some interconnection between the 3 systems. And down on the lower left side of the map, some upcoming redevelopment that then there'd be a great opportunity to serve those buildings when they come on. All of the buildings within the area, or the majority of the buildings within the downtown corridor now are existing buildings, so we will have that other challenge of timing with when they're replacing their boilers and chillers, when it's economically feasible for them to connect to the system. But technically, we looked at it, we saw a real good opportunity. You've got excess capacity at a number of the systems that serve the public buildings in the area. Now we have to figure out how to do it from an organizational and a financing perspective. I talked earlier about how DEC is set up. DEC is managed by Lincoln Electric, which is the local municipal electric utility. But DEC is its own entity that is structured as a cooperative or an interlocal agency. And so when it was set up, there was not really a thought about serving private buildings. It was strictly served for purposes of serving government buildings. And so when you go back and you think about how the organizational articles of incorporation were structured and how the rate structures are set up and everything, it was a lot simpler then. It was just an easy pass-through with the government buildings. Now we have to kind of pull that apart and look at what are the things that are going to prevent that from happening, or prevent growth to private buildings from happening, and how can we restructure to be able to enable that to occur. So there are some restrictions allowing service only to government entities. We have to rewrite the articles of incorporation. There's agreements between DEC and the various public entities that when the debt is retired on any individual plant, that public entity or the buildings that are getting served actually take ownership of the system. So there has to be a reset of that, because certainly you're not going to want to go sell to private buildings if at any given point you could actually lose access and control of those generation assets. Within certain amount of the customer base, the existing public customers and in the special service district, there has to be consent that the infrastructure and the assets could actually be utilized to serve private buildings, so that excess capacity can actually get sold out to private customers. And then there's a question of risk appetite. Certainly with the public entities, the public buildings that are getting served right now, and the way in which the energy service agreement is structured, it's a very low risk program. Adding in private customers, some of whom are rated, some of whom aren't, it will change the risk appetite and the cost of debt for DEC. Right now, DEC enjoys an extremely low cost of debt, and when they go on 100% debt finance all of their infrastructure investments, this will change it. This will change the way in which things are structured, or the way in which the energy costs are structured. And ultimately, by way of how DEC has financed their systems, there's with tax-exempt debt, there are some restrictions around private use from that from that tax-exempt debt. So not being able to have private benefit from public investment. So those are some of our constraints. Some of the factors we have to consider. Again, working through changing of the government documents. What is the right way to grow? Does it make sense to bring in more taxable debt versus just continuing to leverage that tax exempt? We want to figure out a way how not to negatively affect the overall cost of debt and drop down the rating for DEC. And then again, there's that question for the current stakeholders: is leaving well enough okay, or leaving everything alone good enough, or are they comfortable with that higher risk or higher level of risk in return for a long-term vision of lower energy rates? So we looked at 4 different scenarios, and this was a really iterative process with the leadership at DEC, with Dan and his team, with their attorneys, and you could imagine governing documents for 3 different entities, having to look into each of them, and making sure also then that the subsequent energy service agreements aren't negatively affected by what we're recommending. And we identified 4 likely scenarios, and I guess it was last July brought those scenarios back to DEC's board and for their guidance. And I'll go into a little more detail on each of those here. So scenario one was the easiest if we could pull it off, and that is you insert a public entity for purposes of a take-or-pay contract. That public entity essentially is taking all of the risk of the additional debt going out to serve the private customer base, and that entity ends up being kind of the energy service supplier to the private buildings under just a utility type based agreement. That's how the West Haymarket Special Service District is structured right now, generally, and that again, it would be the easiest. It's not necessarily realistic all the time, and I don't want to say that this is the silver bullet, because most of the time you aren't going to have a public entity who's just going to say, yeah, we'll take all the risk. Not a lot of taxpayers are going to be overly excited about that. So it certainly has its advantages. It would offer a significantly low cost of debt, and there's a way in which things could get done a lot quicker if we were able to leverage one of the existing entities to actually go out and issue that debt. It does have some disadvantages. There is DEC and Lincoln Electric, who manages DEC, does a fantastic job with customer service and with managing the systems and efficiently serving the customers. But when you put that additional entity in between, there are gaps at times. So day-to-day, boots on the ground, building managers know their LES contact that they can call to make sure that they have service coming to them on an ongoing basis reliably. But once you start getting bills coming through, and that public institution is receiving the bill and then issuing it, receiving the big bill and then issuing it to all these private customers, I'm looking at you guys. I know we're talking about the same thing in Ottawa right now, so it's there's challenges, right? Because a customer gets a bill that they don't like, and who are they going to call? They're going to call the DEC LES representative who's in their building every week, and they're going to start complaining, why am I getting charged X when I should only be getting charged Y? And that person has no idea why that bill got issued as it is or how things got structured. So there are challenges that come with it too. It's ease of implementation, yeah, but and low cost, yes, but now there's another intermediary, and so you can have challenges with that. Another option we looked at is there's two variations of this. DEC is a traditional utility. The first one is issuing tax-exempt debt. This would be a scenario where DEC then would just publish a utility rate, and you wouldn't have take-or-pay contracts. Customers would just connect. There'd be a published rate, just like LES does with their electric service. You'd have a published thermal rate, and you would essentially set that up and adjust it based on your projected customer load or who was connecting. Of course, there's challenges with that. Folks aren't on take or pay. Now somebody's taking the risk of investing in infrastructure, and if gas prices go down to $2 for some reason, is everybody abandoning the system? And now you've got a significant amount of investment in the ground and in plants that you can't recover. It also would have an effect on how the existing customers are served, and you essentially would have two different types of rate structures for different customers on the system, some on take or pay contracts, some on utility grade contracts. So it does come with changes. And then of course, depending upon where all of the risk sets, there could be some significant change to the interest rate that DEC is going to be able to get with their financing. The other option we looked at was restructuring the debt and running the mix of debt. You've got the LDHC tax-exempt debt that you can do for the distribution. That's a law that's been in place for quite a long time. But as it relates to the plant, you'd actually start to project your taxable versus tax-exempt debt mix based upon what you figured your customer base is going to be. So if you thought you're going to have 40% of your load private, you'd go out and issue 40% taxable debt versus tax-exempt debt. So you'd run that mix, continuing to manage it, and that's actually at District Energy St. Paul. That's what we do, because we do have a mix of public and private, And so we're continually balancing for purposes of our plant investments, where is our public-private split. So again, another option, it once more, it allows a greater level of confidence in being able to service that debt because you've got take-or-pay contracts. But you have take-or-pay contracts with some entities that have lower ratings or are non-rated customers, and so of course that's going to drive up our cost of debt there too. So the last scenario that we looked at DEC was just retaining the current structure, getting some of the constraints addressed regarding serving private buildings and being able, or having some of the bylaws redone so that actually DEC can go out and serve private buildings, but managing that within the 10% limit. So that 10% private use limit until the debt is serviced, just growing to that level. And so going back, one of the first things I said is just getting this off the ground is challenging. And if you can take that first step within the limits of the current debt structure, you don't have to do a lot. You can get some private customers connected to the system, and then as debt starts getting retired, you can look at opportunities to grow to serve additional buildings and grow your system. So this, we all talk about district energy systems. They're long-term investments. This is the long-term strategy, recognizing where you want to go, but also that you have a lot of constraints and you don't want to expose the organization to too much risk right away for purposes of that growth. Direction was given from the board that we start with this. We continue to look for opportunities to introduce another option if there's a fantastic growth opportunity that's presented to us, to DEC in the short term, but recognizing there's a longer term vision here. Let's get all of the organizational constraints out of the way. Let's make sure we leverage the threshold, that 10% threshold, as quickly as we can, and then look for opportunities for growth thereafter, and in the future, hopefully it'll be more apparent as to which is the right strategy for future financing. So that's where we're going with DEC right now. We've been working with Dan and his team, identifying the right customers to connect first that still would maintain us within that 10% threshold, and at the same time removing some of the constraints that that were previously in place regarding the agreements with each of the institutions, regarding the asset transfer once debt is retired, and some of those items. So before I go to the next case study, I just open it up for questions at this point, see if anybody has any questions regarding DEC. It was all perfectly apparent, right? Yeah, I wish. Okay, so I can ask at the end too if something comes up. The other scenario, or the other case study I wanted to talk through is more of an example of starting from scratch. And again, in the previous discussions, there was talk about having all the stakeholders engaged early and identifying what's success as it relates to them. Here's a scenario where you've got a private institution in the San Francisco Giants, you've got the San Francisco Port, and you've got the City of San Francisco looking to redevelop what is now a surface parking lot, 28-acre site just on the south side of AT&T Ballpark. It's fascinating. It was fascinating for me getting involved in this project. You learn a little bit more about the inside baseball, no pun intended, but the Red Sox actually perfected a strategy of developing real estate outside of their ballpark because they do not have to revenue share any of the profits they receive from any of that real estate development. So anything that happens as it relates to baseball operations, there's revenue sharing. Anything that happens related to development of the adjacent area, they don't have to revenue share any of that. And so when the Giants moved and built AT&T Ballpark, they did it with pretty much all of their own money. They were fully leveraged for purposes of building that, and this was in an area of San Francisco that was not really in very great shape when the ballpark was built. So the Giants had no opportunity to grow or to redevelop anything around the ballpark, and all of the other developers within the community came in and started gobbling up the land and profiting off of the Giants building the ballpark. This is their one big opportunity to do that, and it's really the last undeveloped piece of land within the Mission Bay area, and so it's owned by the land is owned by the San Francisco Port. The Giants are the master developer of the site. There's some commitments, and on the next slide I'll get to as it relates to this site, but it's Fran Weld with the Giants actually was in Boston 2 years ago and presented on this when they were much earlier in their development program. This last year they came out with an RFP to select a preferred developer of the district energy system that's going to serve this site, and so we will be the developer, operator, and manager of that system. And the Giants, of course, are the master developer of all of the buildings. They will likely develop a high percentage of those buildings, and they'll have some other developers come in, particularly for the residential construction. This site, there have been some significant, in order for all of the approvals to have been put in place, and there's actually a referendum about a year and a half ago, if not 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, where the Giants and the Port made some significant commitments related to this site regarding energy consumption and social equity and the amount of truly affordable housing that would be on that site, and transportation and waste reduction, zero potable water use for non-potable purposes. So there are a lot of driving goals for this system, and of course they still want to have a district energy system that can provide cost-effective solutions to the site. So we've been, over the last year, working with the Giants to define the load, what we expect truly the load on the site to be. It's not a significant energy load, which is good, but also makes developing a district energy system a little more challenging when you're looking at the economics. Because we need to be carbon free, we looked at, Ken and the others were talking about that mix of integration. To get to carbon free, you still have to have a thermal grid, but you have to be, you're electrifying the campus, and then you have to find something to displace that natural gas consumption that would otherwise happen. So we actually identified two opportunities, and they're right now competing with each other to get to what is going to be the most, or the preferred implementation. But the two opportunities, it's easier to show on this map. There's the primary sanitary sewer collection line interceptor that receives all of the sewage from downtown San Francisco, actually runs right down this street here and then diverts, and there's a pumping station that sends it down to a water treatment plant. Runs about 90 million gallons per day of wastewater through it. The other option then is to run pipes out into the bay and actually have the bay water being the primary energy source for purposes of serving the system. Both of them have their benefits, both of them have their challenges. Clearly the Army Corps permitting process on the bay water side will be tough, or lengthy, I should say, and on the sanitary sewer side, just the integration with San Francisco Water and making sure operations aren't affected, and also tearing up a street that's got a light rail on it for purposes of interfacing with the sanitary sewer line. So there's some challenges there too. It just really depends on timing as to which technical solution gets implemented. The Giants EIR process has been, for the overall site, closed just a few weeks ago. The EIR, the public comment period was very benign, and so the target had been to see all development approvals coming in this fall, and that still looks very positive. Actual timing of development is really dependent upon the market. So whether it's first quarter of 18 or it could go as late as first quarter of 19, that's still up in the air. So that's a little bit background on the system. When we got engaged, though, we needed to talk with the Giants, with the Port, and with the city as to how did they want to see this structured. They have some very clear goals attributed to this site, and we wanted to make sure we structured the district energy business in a manner whose mission was first and foremost achieving those goals that they had established, and that we didn't set up competing visions, competing goals from the energy system that might be different from what all of the stakeholders there wanted to see. And because it's one site that's going to get broken into a number of parcels. We have a little bit more opportunity to actually structure the district energy system and the energy service agreements in a manner that sales process will go a little bit easier. We looked at several options for structuring the actual business. We looked at a nonprofit, setting up, whether it be a 501c3 or not, but setting up a nonprofit business with cost-based rates. And we actually had recommended that was the ultimate solution that they went with because of the goals they wanted to see. That would enable the city, the port, the Giants to have a board-level participation for the district energy business to make sure that 5, 10, 20 years from now, they're continuing to have a say in how the business is governed and the direction it takes as new technologies come out and as growth is looked at. There is a process that needs to be gone through for purposes of getting the 501c3 status. It's a process we've done before, so we're comfortable, and we feel that based on this system, it should be pretty easy to actually achieve. There are some higher initial formation costs, a little bit less flexibility in the future, and some increased oversight, but we still believe that it's the right structure for this development and for these partners. We did also talk about a California Public Benefit Corporation. It was an option. When compared with the 501c3 nonprofit, it's a little more costly, so the rates for customers would be a little higher. There's some increased regulation when compared to a public entity, or a private entity, just a for-profit scenario, because you do have some restrictions. But when you compare this to the 501c3 just helps us achieve those goals a little more cost effectively and a little easier. We also looked at with the Giants, what would just bringing in outside equity investment look like, and is that the right structure, and is that the right solution? And while at times that is the right scenario, there's certainly folks in here who have run very successful district energy businesses under that model. Based on what the community wanted to see happen at that site, we all collectively agreed last December that this wasn't what's best for this system. So we went through a fairly exhaustive process with the city and the port and the Giants, going into a pretty high level of detail on each of these options and laying out different energy rate structures under each of the three scenarios, what the energy cost would look like, what governance could look like, and how the system would go out and get financed. And we ultimately did then pick that solution of the nonprofit. We did actually make a further recommendation that's being worked through right now with the port and the city, and that would be that there'd be a credit enhancement provided by the port. The port owns the land, and so the provision of credit enhancement to that debt financing would do two things. It would lower the energy service rates, so it would increase the value of the land that the port is going to receive when all of this site gets developed. It also allows an opportunity for the port to receive a fee from the district energy business for purposes of providing that credit enhancement. So they receive monetary benefit twice, all while the tenants of the site actually see a lower cost of energy. So it provides that guarantee that we would need, where otherwise we would be going out with a mix of non-rated and lower rated customer base, and we'd see a relatively higher level of cost of the equity that it's going to take to build the system out. So you can see that the numbers on the interest rate, when you're looking at roughly $30 to $40 million of infrastructure investment, it's significant enough and has a drastic enough effect on the overall cost of energy for the customers. So we're working through more of the details right now. Again, the financing model is we go 100% debt financing. About 2/3 of the annual cost of the system would be debt, because of the fact that it's either going to be a free energy source from the sanitary sewer or a free energy source from the bay water. As a result, customers are going to see a fairly significant decrease in their energy rates, which then enables that revenue stream to go back to the port, as I talked about earlier, and then that enhanced land value benefit as well. So my summary, because it's just an epiphany that you've never heard before, but I mean, that's the reality. It's depending upon where you're at, depending upon the needs, there is no perfect solution, and you just have to figure out, I think the folks earlier talked about, you have to get all the stakeholders in, and you have to talk about what success looks like for the folks there, and then you start figuring out how to get there. Questions?
When they set up the next part of the afternoon?
Yeah.
So Michael, when you landed on the not-for-profit 100% debt finance model, so you got your pro forma now, but does that make it more difficult? Because these projects tend to evolve, things come up, technologies are delivered, storage or other technologies that are capital intensive become available or an option. Does that model become more difficult then as the project capital needs change and there's new demand for capital?
It can, and we've talked about that as we're looking at the options, and even looking at that option, how do we set that up to enable that future investment, if needed, outside investment? District Energy St. Paul is a good example where we were started out as a 501c3, but then when we wanted to integrate biomass, we leveraged an outside investment to do that. So we had to set up a secondary organization for purposes of that private activity investment, and then set up arrangements between the two institutions for the supply of that energy. So it does add a challenge. I think that the DEC example is an example where those are some of those challenges. We're restructuring some agreements and restructuring governance to enable it. It doesn't prevent it, but it certainly does. It's something now that we're thinking about, that we've learned over the last 35 years, so that when and if that comes up, we can more easily overcome it. Yes.
Could you come up to the mic?
Maybe you already talked about it, but do your debt covenants preclude you or shape the kind of outside financing post-project?
Do the debt?
When you go for 100% debt financing, do the debt covenants influence the type of outside financing, third-party financing post-project?
Yeah, so do the debt covenants affect going out and obtaining more additional financing post? Absolutely they do, absolutely. So we take that into consideration when structuring the original documents and when we structure the original issuance. And actually, it's interesting, I've referred several times to the Ottawa project. That's a scenario where we're actually structuring the entire RFP in a manner where the original bondholders are going to be able to see a quick termination of their issuance before there's additional debt brought into the system, because they don't want to see any deviation from what was the original program that the debt was issued against, because adding a customer is adding risk to those original bondholders, and you don't want a scenario where you have to go and ask permission every single time you want to grow and add another customer. So you really have to be thoughtful about that going in. Michael?
In your last case study in San Francisco, you mentioned that about 2/3 of the cost is going to be in terms of debt financing the infrastructure, because the source is going to be from the bay or sewage system. In terms of actually how that is presented in a tariff, are you assuming that would be a fixed charge of 2/3 and a variable charge of 1/3? And if that's the case, have you given any thought in terms of the palatability for end consumers? Because that's going to be very, very different to what we used to.
Yeah, so yes, we have given thought to that, and actually we've laid out the draft energy rate structure to the developing partners for the site, and we're going through that discussion right now to get it to a point where it's something that they view as most attractive for purposes of integrating into their pro forma. So we're going through an iteration with them and making sure that it fits with how they're going to be looking at their financials. Our original program that we've suggested to them is that there's a fixed demand charge and an energy charge, and I think we'll stay on some variation of that, but we may deviate a little bit just because of their feedback that they come back. The good piece about this one, about this project, or what makes that a little easier, is because it's a bit of a captive audience between the giants and then the developing teams that they've brought on board already. We get to have those conversations as they're thinking about their development plans for the buildings versus in, say, Markham or at District Energy St. Paul or in Phoenix, where new developer comes in every time a new building is built, and you've got to go through that education process again and again and again. Okay.
My name is Sylvia Kurma. I'm from Con Ed. I have a quick question regarding the DEC you mentioned. My question is about, you mentioned that it's critical to line up the first customers that are within the 10% threshold of ROE and get the buy-in to start in. You also mentioned that you kind of have a list of criteria. You're evaluating who are those customers based on the optimum energy consumption, based on the block and lot, and probably a bunch of other criterias. My question is, like, how complicated and how complex is the process of really sorting out the customers and coming up with the top, whatever they make the cut line of ROE, if you're going to run the entire energy as a utility type of district energy?
So I think what you asked is, how complicated is the process to identify who are the most financially and technically compatible buildings?
Correct. Yes.
So it's not necessarily complicated, it's tedious, and it literally is going through a building by building analysis, meeting with the building managers, walking through the buildings, looking at their mechanical rooms, talking to them at a business level about what's important, how soon are they going to be replacing assets, what is their building strategy for the next 10 years. An example I gave you I can give is, there's one specific customer, we met with them at the beginning of the feasibility study, and they had very clear plan from a heating and cooling perspective. Their chilled water assets were in good shape. Their heating assets are close to the end of their useful life. 9 months we go through the process, we come back, sit with them. They've replaced a cooling tower, the boiler's fine, they don't need to replace that for 5 years, and so then you have to react to that. So it's not necessarily complicated, it's tedious, and then to the extent that it extends, you run the risk of things changing without you even knowing about
I
it.
just want to add to that, this will be really beneficial for other people who are looking at district heating if there's a database of people putting their plans, their list, something that is more accessible for others, because you already did the legwork. Maybe somebody else can benefit from that in the neighborhood if there's the district. But thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. It's very encouraging for me to see that Dan Dixon, when Dan first came to present his project at IDA, I felt the passion, and I'm very pleased to see you've moved on in the life cycle. And then the giants as well, I remember their presentation. So very heartening to see that some of the projects that get their first hearing at IDA are actually going to the bank.